The winter of 1944 pressed its weight upon Europe like a suffocating hand. Forests of the Ardennes stood silent under blankets of snow, their branches drooping under ice and exhaustion. The war that had begun with lightning speed 5 years earlier had slowed to a grinding crawl, its thunder replaced by the muffled echo of distant artillery. Yet, in Adolf Hitler's mind, one final gamble remained, a last strike that might turn despair into victory. That gamble was the Ardennes offensive, soon to be known as the Battle of the Bulge. Among the German commanders chosen for this desperate counterattack was SS-Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, a name already etched in both fear and admiration across the European front. At 30 years old, Peiper embodied the ruthless efficiency of the Waffen-SS. Handsome, charismatic, and fiercely loyal to the Nazi cause, he had risen through the ranks as one of Heinrich Himmler's favorite protégés. His reputation preceded him, a soldier of unquestioned courage and equally unquestioned brutality. When Peiper was summoned in December 1944, his orders were both simple and impossible. He was to spearhead the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandard Adolf Hitler through the Ardennes, break through the American lines, seize key bridges over the Meuse River, and race toward Antwerp. If the plan succeeded, Allied forces in Belgium and the Netherlands would be split apart, perhaps forcing the Western Allies to negotiate. But to accomplish that, Peiper's Kampfgruppe needed something Germany no longer had in abundance: fuel. In the months leading to the offensive, German logistics had collapsed under Allied bombing campaigns. Oil refineries were shattered, synthetic fuel plants crippled, and rail networks torn apart. Panzer divisions, once symbols of mechanized dominance, now sat idle for lack of gasoline. Every drop counted. Hitler's plan for the Ardennes was as ambitious as it was blind to reality. It required fuel Germany could no longer produce. Peiper's column would consist of about 5,000 men, over 100 tanks and armored vehicles, and nearly 500 support trucks. Before the offensive even began, his fuel supplies were barely enough to reach the Meuse, let alone return. Officers quietly joked that the entire operation depended on capturing Allied fuel dumps along the way, a cruel irony that would soon become deadly serious. At dawn on December 16, 1944, the German guns opened fire. The calm of the Ardennes shattered beneath a roar that rolled across the frozen hills. Shells tore through American positions held by Green troops of the 99th and 106th Infantry Divisions. Under cover of the barrage, Peiper's armored spearhead began to move. Tiger and Panther tanks rumbled along narrow roads slick with ice, their treads grinding snow into black mud. Peiper rode near the front in his command car, his eyes fixed forward, face carved from determination and impatience. He had studied maps of the terrain for days, memorizing every village, every bend in the road. His mission was to move fast, to strike before the Americans could react. But the terrain was against him. The Ardennes was no place for tanks. Dense woods, narrow valleys, and twisting roads slowed everything to a crawl. The first day's advance met both success and chaos. Peiper's column overran several American outposts, capturing bewildered soldiers who barely knew an attack had begun. Yet delays multiplied. Bridges collapsed, roads jammed with wrecks, and resistance stiffened around Stavelot and Boulingen. Every hour lost drained the offensive of its one advantage: surprise. By the night of December 17th, Peiper's men were exhausted. They had pushed deep into enemy territory, but fuel gauges hovered near empty. The Tigers, monstrous machines that consumed nearly 2 gallons per mile, were already gulping their reserves faster than expected. Reports crackled over the radio. Tanks running dry, requesting resupply. No contact with rear units. The Luftwaffe was grounded by weather, and American air superiority hung like a curse waiting to return once the clouds cleared. Peiper's staff maps showed a small village ahead, Honsfeld. Intelligence suggested the Americans had used it as a staging area before retreating. Perhaps, Peiper reasoned, there would be supplies, perhaps even fuel. He ordered the column forward through the darkness. Honsfeld lay silent beneath the snow. The Americans had abandoned it in haste, leaving behind scattered equipment, wrecked jeeps, and frozen rations. As Peiper's lead units entered the village, their engines echoing between the houses, no gunfire greeted them. Only the wind, whispering through broken shutters. Then came the discovery. Behind a cluster of houses half buried under camouflage nets stood rows of steel drums and tanker trucks, the insignia stenciled in bold white. U.S. Army, fuel supply. The markings read 80-octane gasoline. A German sergeant pried one open, and the sharp smell of pure fuel filled the air. For a moment, silence hung over the men. Disbelief mingled with triumph. 50,000 gallons. Enough to keep Peiper's tanks running for days. Enough to push deeper into the Allied lines. Soldiers shouted in relief. Some laughed aloud. "The Americans have refueled us," one joked. Mechanics scrambled to siphon the gasoline into German trucks and barrels. Engines roared back to life, exhaust smoke curling into the frozen air. Peiper inspected the find personally. He knew its value instantly, but what he felt was not elation. It was something colder, a realization that twisted deep within him. If the Americans could abandon this much fuel and not even notice, what did that say about the balance of power in this war? To them, 50,000 gallons was nothing. To Germany, it was a treasure worth killing for. He turned to one of his officers and muttered, almost to himself, "They can afford to throw it away. We cannot even produce it." In that instant, the myth of German invincibility cracked further. Peiper had spent his career believing in the technical and tactical superiority of the Wehrmacht, that discipline, courage, and precision could overcome material shortages. But here, in this frozen Belgian village, surrounded by barrels of American fuel, he saw the truth. Germany was no longer fighting an equal enemy. It was fighting an industrial giant capable of replenishing what it lost faster than Germany could dream of replacing it. His men did not sense his unease. For them, it was a victory, a rare stroke of luck in a campaign already plagued by hardship. They drank captured American coffee, ate chocolate bars, and filled their canteens with melted snow. But Peiper's thoughts drifted elsewhere, to the factories of Detroit, the refineries of Texas, and the endless convoys crossing the Atlantic. The numbers haunted him. America's oil production dwarfed Germany's by 50-1. Even if the Ardennes offensive reached Antwerp, even if the Allies were pushed back, it would change nothing. The war machine that stood behind the United States was limitless. He ordered his column to move on. The fuel they had captured would not last long, and delay meant death. The road to Stavelot lay ahead, but American resistance was beginning to stir. Scouts reported enemy armor regrouping. The once quiet hills of the Ardennes were now alive with gunfire echoing through the trees. As the column advanced, the toll of the offensive became clearer. Burned-out German half-tracks lined the road. Frozen corpses, both American and German, lay half-buried in snowdrifts. Smoke rose from villages reduced to rubble. The idyllic winter landscape had become a frozen graveyard. Peiper's command vehicle pushed onward. He was silent, eyes fixed on the horizon. Inside, he carried the weight of knowledge that few commanders admitted, that Germany's war was over, even if its soldiers refused to believe it. Hitler's fantasy of splitting the Allied front would end, as all fantasies do, consumed by reality. The Third Reich was running not only out of fuel but out of time. That night, Peiper's men bivouacked near La Gaulize. The cold was unbearable. Even the engines, left running to prevent freezing, struggled against the chill. The captured American gasoline burned hot and clean in their tanks, a bitter reminder of its source. Around campfires, men spoke of the strange fortune of finding it. Some took it as a sign that fate still favored them. Others, older and wiser, said little. They had seen too much to mistake coincidence for destiny. Far behind them, the German high command was losing contact with reality. Reports from the front were confusing, contradictory, and delayed. Hitler raged in his headquarters at the slow progress, unwilling to accept that his divisions were running dry. Peiper's name appeared in communiques as a symbol of progress, Peiper advancing successfully. But success measured in kilometers meant nothing when the fuel that powered those tanks came from enemy barrels. On the morning of December 18th, Peiper's unit encountered heavy resistance near Stavelot. The Americans, recovering from the initial shock, had begun to organize. Artillery fire thundered down from hidden positions. Snow exploded into plumes of white smoke. German tanks replied, their cannons roaring through the fog. The road became a cauldron of fire and confusion. Even as he directed his men, Peiper could not shake the memory of that fuel depot. Every tank shell that flew, every vehicle destroyed, underscored what he already knew: Germany's resources were bleeding out. His Tigers, magnificent machines of engineering, were monsters that consumed their own lifeblood faster than it could be replenished. Each mile forward was another nail driven into the coffin of the Reich. Still, he fought on. Orders were orders. Whatever his doubts, Peiper remained a soldier. He had sworn loyalty to his command and to the man in the bunker who still believed in miracles. But deep inside, that belief was gone. As darkness fell again over the Ardennes, Peiper stood beside his tank, the distant fires reflecting off his uniform. Around him lay the sounds of a dying offensive, sputtering engines, wounded men calling for medics, the dull thud of artillery fading into the night. Somewhere beyond the trees, American engineers were already replacing what he had captured, refueling new columns, readying new tanks. 50,000 gallons had meant salvation for a day, nothing more. To the Americans, it was barely a drop in an ocean. To Peiper, it had been the mirror in which Germany saw its fate. The fires of Stavelot burned through the night, flickering against the snow-covered rooftops and casting long, dancing shadows over the narrow Belgian streets. The town had become a choke point for Peiper's column, a crossroads that would decide whether his advance could continue or grind to a halt. The faint rumble of American armor echoed through the hills, a sound that grew louder with each passing hour. Peiper stood beside a Tiger tank as engineers worked feverishly to clear a destroyed American truck blocking the main road. He stared into the flames consuming the village church, his mind detached from the chaos around him. The captured American fuel had given his unit the strength to move this far, but already the barrels were nearly empty again. Every tank in his column was a hungry beast, consuming precious gasoline by the minute. A young lieutenant approached, his face pale from cold and exhaustion. "Herr Obersturmbannführer," he reported, "we've lost contact with the rear elements. The Americans are closing in from the south." Peiper nodded slowly, saying nothing for a long moment. Then, with a calmness that unnerved even his veterans, he replied, "We keep moving. If we stop, we die here." Orders were relayed down the line. Engines coughed to life, tracks grinding over frozen mud. The men of Camp Peiper were bone-tired, many having slept barely an hour in 3 days. Yet they obeyed without question. They knew the stakes. To be captured by the Americans was uncertain. To fail in their orders was unthinkable. As dawn broke on December 19th, fog rolled across the hills. Visibility dropped to mere meters. From the mist, American artillery opened fire, shells shrieking overhead and bursting among the lead vehicles. Shrapnel ripped through the air, tearing open fuel drums and igniting trails of flame that raced along the snow. German soldiers dove for cover as trucks exploded one after another, sending plumes of black smoke spiraling into the gray sky. Peiper's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "Push forward. Clear the town." The Tigers answered with thunder. Their 88mm guns shattered walls and silenced machine gun nests. Civilians fled or hid in basements as the street fighting consumed Stavelot. Snow mixed with soot and blood until the whole town seemed painted in shades of gray and red. By midday, the Germans held most of the town, but victory meant little. Reports came in that American engineers had blown the bridge north of Stavelot, cutting off Peiper's route of advance. To the south, other units of the 1st SS Panzer Division were delayed. His column now stood isolated, a steel spear thrust too deep into enemy territory. Fuel was again the tyrant. The captured gasoline from Honsfeld was nearly gone, siphoned into tanks that now idled uselessly, waiting for orders. The logistical chain behind Peiper had disintegrated. The roads they had advanced on were now clogged with wrecks, abandoned vehicles, and the frozen corpses of men who had marched into the storm believing in victory. Peiper gathered his officers in a small farmhouse at the edge of town. The windows were blown out, snow drifting across the floor. Around a makeshift map table, they discussed their options. "We cannot go forward without fuel," one said bluntly. "And if we stay here, the Americans will surround us." Peiper studied the map in silence. He knew they were right, but retreat was forbidden. Hitler's orders were explicit: no withdrawal, no surrender. The offensive must push west, no matter the cost. Disobeying those orders was not only treason, it was suicide. He finally spoke, his voice low. "We hold until relief reaches us. If we run out of fuel, we fight on foot." The officers nodded, though none truly believed relief would come. The fog of war had swallowed communication. Radio messages went unanswered. Couriers disappeared. Somewhere behind them, the German advance was collapsing under its own weight. Peiper's campgroup had become an island in a sea of enemies. Outside, soldiers scavenged for anything that could burn: gasoline, wood, even the contents of abandoned American trucks. They stripped the dead for winter coats, melted snow for drinking water, and huddled beside their vehicles for warmth. The once formidable armored column that had set out with pride now looked like a convoy of ghosts. By the afternoon of December 20th, the Americans counterattacked in force. The 30th Infantry Division, reinforced with Sherman tanks, struck from the west. Artillery rained down on Stavelot, blasting holes in walls and sending fragments of masonry through the air. German machine gunners returned fire until their barrels glowed red. Peiper moved among his men, directing fire and rallying defenses. His uniform was covered in soot. His eyes burned with fatigue. "Hold the line," he shouted, though he knew the line was crumbling. Amid the battle, he thought again of that moment in Honsfeld, the barrels of fuel gleaming under the snow, the smell of victory turning sour. What could have it done? 50,000 gallons had bought them another 48 hours of life, nothing more. The truth he had glimpsed then was now undeniable. Germany's power was an illusion sustained by desperation. As night fell, Peiper ordered a withdrawal toward Logistical, hoping to regroup and establish a defensive perimeter. The column moved slowly through the darkness, headlights covered to avoid detection. Snow muffled the sounds of engines, giving the march an eerie silence. Behind them, Stavelot burned. When they reached Logistical in the early hours of December 21st, Peiper's men were near collapse. Ammunition was low, fuel nearly gone, and morale slipping into despair. They had advanced nearly 40 miles into enemy territory, only to find themselves trapped. Logistical became their fortress. Peiper established his command post in a stone house overlooking the valley. From there he could see the road they had come from, a white scar winding through the forest, now littered with wrecks. He sent radio messages pleading for resupply, for fuel, for reinforcements. The replies, when they came, were hollow promises: "Hold fast. Help is on the way." But help never came. The skies cleared, and with the clouds went Germany's last advantage. American fighter-bombers returned in swarms, strafing the roads and turning every movement into a deadly gamble. Trucks were blown apart before they could deliver supplies. Peiper's isolation was complete. For days, his men held out against relentless attacks. They fought with stubborn courage, clinging to every house and hedge line. When their tanks ran dry, they used them as bunkers. Infantry crouched behind their steel hulls, firing rifles and Panzerfausts at advancing Shermans. The air smelled of gunpowder and frozen oil. Inside his headquarters, Peiper read intercepted American reports describing his position as cut off and surrounded. The Allies now viewed his campgroup as a prize, a symbol of Hitler's failed offensive. Capturing or destroying it would mark the end of the Bulge. On December 23rd, he gathered his remaining officers once more. The room was dimly lit by a single lantern. The men were gaunt, their faces hollow from hunger and cold. "We have no more fuel," one reported. "The last Tiger stopped an hour ago." Peiper's gaze moved from face to face. "Then we destroy the vehicles. Nothing falls into enemy hands." The order spread through the ranks. One by one, German tanks were set ablaze, their ammunition detonating in thunderous bursts that lit the night sky. Flames reflected off the snow like the glow of some distant apocalypse. Men watched silently as the machines they had worshipped, their invincible panzers, were reduced to twisted, burning hulks. That night, Peiper wrote a brief message in his field diary. "The fuel that kept us alive now burns to mark our grave." By Christmas Eve, the situation was hopeless. American forces closed in from all sides. Peiper's men were out of fuel, out of ammunition, and out of time. He made the decision no German officer wanted to make, to abandon the wounded and break out on foot. In the pre-dawn darkness of December 24th, Peiper led about 800 survivors through the woods, leaving behind their dead and dying comrades. The snow was knee-deep. Temperatures plunged below freezing. They carried only what they could: rifles, pistols, and the memory of what they had been. The once proud, armored column had become a column of shadows. As they trudged through the forest, the distant glow of La Gleize burning behind them, Peiper's thoughts returned again to that depot in Honsfeld. In that moment of triumph, he had seen the truth more clearly than any general in Berlin. Germany's defeat was not measured in battles lost or towns captured. It was measured in gallons of fuel, in barrels of oil, in the industrial rhythm of a nation that could outproduce and outlast them all. To the Americans, 50,000 gallons was a rounding error. To Germany, it had been a symbol and a revelation. Peiper had realized that day that they were no longer soldiers fighting for victory, but men fighting to delay the inevitable. By December 26th, after days of marching through snow and enemy patrols, Peiper and the remnants of his unit finally reached German lines near One. Of the thousands who had begun the offensive with him, barely a fraction returned. Exhausted, frostbitten, and broken, they stumbled into friendly territory more dead than alive. Peiper's face was gaunt, his uniform torn, his boots soaked through. When an officer asked for a report, he simply replied, "No fuel, no men, no future." Word of his breakout spread quickly through German ranks. Some hailed him as a hero for leading his men through impossible odds. Others whispered that the entire offensive had been madness from the start. In truth, both were right. The Ardennes offensive had begun as a desperate dream and ended as a nightmare, a final, futile gesture of a dying empire. The fuel depot at Honsfeld, once a fleeting miracle, became a symbol in Peiper's mind. The moment when illusion met reality. The realization that Germany's might, its armor, its courage, meant nothing against the endless tide of American production. The United States had produced 1.8 billion barrels of oil during the war. Germany, barely 33 million. That disparity was not merely a statistic. It was destiny. It determined which tanks rolled forward and which ran dry in the snow. It determined which nation could fight another day and which would crumble from within. For Peiper, the memory of those gleaming barrels haunted him long after the guns fell silent. It was the day he understood that Germany was not losing the war. It had already lost it. When Joachim Peiper crossed back into German-held territory in late December 1944, the war he returned to was not the same one he had left behind. The promise of Hitler's last offensive had collapsed beneath the weight of its own delusion. What had begun as a bold strike through the Ardennes had ended in chaos, destruction, and loss. The roads leading back from Belgium were littered with burned-out tanks, dead horses, and shattered dreams. The grand counterattack that was meant to change the course of history had done nothing but hasten Germany's downfall. Peiper's name, once synonymous with daring victories, now carried a strange echo, part admiration, part tragedy. He had survived what many called the death ride of the 1st SS Panzer Division, but survival in those days was not victory. His men, those who returned with him, were ghosts of the army that had set out. Their faces hollow, eyes blank, uniforms torn, they carried the weight of something far heavier than defeat. They had seen the end, not just of a battle, but of a nation's belief in itself. As Peiper made his report to higher command, his words were brief and stripped of illusion. He did not speak of heroic resistance or glorious sacrifice. He spoke of broken supply lines, of empty fuel tanks, of columns stranded and men starving. He described the American superiority in logistics with cold precision, an enemy that could lose tens of thousands of gallons of gasoline and replace them before dawn. The officers who listened nodded grimly, but they already knew. Reports from every front told the same story. Germany was running on fumes, and no amount of bravery could change that. Back in Berlin, Hitler refused to face the truth. From his bunker, he blamed the failure of the Ardennes on poor weather, on cowardice, on betrayal. Anything but the simple fact that Germany had exhausted its ability to fight. He spoke of new weapons, new miracles, the so-called Wunderwaffe, that would turn the tide. But Peiper, like many frontline commanders, knew better. The miracle Germany needed was not a rocket or a jet plane. It was oil. And oil was something the Reich no longer possessed. Peiper spent the first weeks of 1945 reorganizing what remained of his unit. The once proud Kampfgruppe had been reduced to fragments, companies without tanks, platoons without officers. Supplies trickled in slowly, a few trucks of ammunition here, a handful of rations there. But no fuel. The refineries at Luna and Politz lay in ruins, bombed into silence by Allied air raids. Synthetic production plants, once the pride of German chemistry, now stood idle. At night, Peiper sat in his command dugout, listening to the distant rumble of artillery on the Western Front. Each explosion was like a clock ticking down to the inevitable. He wrote in his notebook, sometimes short reflections, sometimes only single sentences, "The Americans fight with engines, we fight with hunger." Another entry read, "Fuel is the blood of war. Ours is clotted." In the early months of 1945, as the Allied advance surged toward the Rhine, the last remnants of Germany's armored divisions tried to form defensive lines. Peiper's men, equipped now with little more than rifles and half-empty trucks, were moved repeatedly from one threatened sector to another. They no longer spoke of victory, only of survival. The memory of Honsfeld haunted Peiper with increasing intensity. He recalled how his men had cheered at the discovery, how laughter had filled the air as they refueled their tanks with captured American gasoline. But beneath that laughter, he now realized, had been the sound of a requiem, the dying breath of Germany's illusion of parity. For every barrel they had taken, the Americans could produce 1,000 more. For every Tiger tank that rolled forward, America built 10 Shermans, each with its own endless supply of fuel. He had once believed in the doctrine of blitzkrieg, that speed, surprise, and aggression could overcome material weakness. But by 1945, that belief was as empty as his fuel reserves. Speed was meaningless without gasoline. Surprise was impossible when the skies belonged to the enemy. By March, the Rhine had fallen. American and British forces poured into Western Germany, their columns stretching from horizon to horizon. Entire German towns surrendered without a fight. Peiper's unit was ordered to retreat east, toward Bavaria, to avoid encirclement. It was a march through a dying land, villages in ruins, refugees streaming eastward, old men and children digging trenches that would never be manned. On the road, Peiper saw the same look in every soldier's eyes, exhaustion mixed with disbelief. For years they had been told that Germany was destined to triumph, that its armies were invincible. Now they trudged through the wreckage of that lie. In the ditches lay the wrecks of tanks without engines, trucks without fuel, and wagons pulled by starving horses. The mighty mechanized army of Europe's conquerors had reverted to a foot army, crippled not by lack of courage, but by lack of energy. It was in those final weeks that Peiper fully understood the scale of Germany's defeat. The war had been lost long before the Battle of the Bulge, lost in the oil fields that Germany never possessed, in the skies filled with American bombers, and in the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh that produced without pause. The men at the front had fought valiantly, but they had fought for a cause already buried under the weight of industrial arithmetic. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, Peiper was captured by American forces near the Austrian border. His once gleaming uniform was tattered, his rank insignia worn down by months of hardship. To his captors, he was just another officer of a defeated army, the one whose name carried a dark reputation. News of atrocities committed by SS units during the campaign in Belgium had spread, massacres of prisoners and civilians. Peiper's name was linked to one in particular, Malmedy. During the initial days of the offensive, elements of his unit had executed American prisoners near the crossroads outside Malmedy. The killings shocked the Allied world and became a rallying cry for vengeance. Though Peiper denied direct involvement, he was held responsible as the commanding officer. To many Americans, he was no longer a soldier, but a war criminal. Imprisoned in a former concentration camp, converted into a holding site for SS officers, Peiper faced months of interrogation. His captors wanted not only confessions, but insight. How could a man like him, intelligent and capable, still believe in a system that had doomed itself? Peiper's answers were detached, analytical. He spoke of loyalty, of duty, of orders. But when asked about Honsfeld, about the moment he realized the war was lost, he hesitated. Then he simply said, "It was the worst thing that could have happened." The interrogator pressed him. "Why? You captured fuel. You extended your mission." Peiper looked down at his hands, fingers still stained from months of oil and grime. "Because in that moment," he said, "I saw what we were fighting against, a country so rich in resources it could abandon what we would kill for. I knew then we were not soldiers in a war anymore. We were participants in our own funeral." That single statement would later be quoted in several war analyses, sometimes dismissed as post-war reflection, other times cited as one of the most haunting acknowledgments of the industrial imbalance that defined World War II. Historians studying the Battle of the Bulge would come to see Peiper's experience at Honsfeld as more than a footnote. It was a moment of symbolic revelation, the collision between ideology and reality. Hitler's Germany had been built on the myth of willpower overcoming weakness, of spirit defeating material. But wars are not won by belief alone. They are won by the ability to sustain armies, feed soldiers, and fuel machines. In retrospect, the entire Ardennes offensive was an echo of that same delusion. It was planned as if courage could replace fuel, as if determination could substitute for oil. The German High Command had gambled the last of its armored strength on the hope that American logistical networks could be broken. Instead, it proved the opposite, that America's industrial reach was so vast that even its supply errors turned into German lifelines. For every barrel Peiper had captured, the U.S. refineries produced another 100,000 before the week was over. The figures were staggering. While Germany produced roughly 33 million barrels of oil throughout the war, the United States churned out nearly 1.8 billion. It was not merely a difference in scale. It was a difference in possibility. This realization became a quiet theme among surviving German officers. In post-war interrogations and memoirs, many acknowledged that they had underestimated the power of American production. One officer wrote, "We fought their soldiers but lost their factories." Another admitted, "It was not their courage that defeated us. It was their logistics." Peiper spent several years imprisoned after the war, eventually tried and convicted for war crimes, though his sentence was later reduced. In captivity, he reflected often on the failure of the Ardennes campaign. Those who visited him found a man both bitter and contemplative, unrepentant in ideology, yet haunted by the cold arithmetic of defeat. He once told a fellow inmate, "The Americans fight like engineers, not warriors. They fight with machines that never stop coming." For historians, Peiper's story became a case study, not of morality, but of military realism. His capture of the Honsfeld fuel dump revealed in miniature the entire imbalance of the war, German bravery and tactical skill meeting American abundance and organization. The Wehrmacht had fought the world's first truly industrial war without the resources to sustain it. Its downfall was not written in battles, but in production charts. In later documentaries, the footage of Honsfeld, the snowy fields, the abandoned American trucks, the gleaming barrels of gasoline, will be shown alongside narration about the futility of the German war effort. The voiceovers would tell audiences that here, amid the frost and silence of the Ardennes, a German colonel realized the war was already lost. And in that realization lay the tragic paradox of the German soldier. Disciplined, courageous, but chained to a cause that had doomed him from the start. The men who followed Peiper into the Ardennes believed they were striking a decisive blow for victory. In truth, they were witnessing the last flicker of a dying flame. As the years passed, Peiper's life after the war remained shadowed by his past. He eventually settled in France under an assumed name, translating books and working quietly. Yet he could never escape what he represented, both the brilliance and the brutality of a lost generation. In 1976, his house was firebombed by unknown assailants, and he was killed in the blaze. Many saw it as an act of vengeance, others as the inevitable conclusion to a life bound to violence. But history remembered something else, that in a small Belgian village called Honsfeld, under a gray December sky, Joachim Peiper had stood before 50,000 gallons of American fuel and seen not salvation, but the reflection of his nation's doom. The road that wound through the Ardennes had grown quiet again. The echoes of tank engines, once a thunder rolling through the Belgian hills, faded into the stillness of winter. The snow that had once muffled the movement of Peiper's men now lay undisturbed, blanketing abandoned wrecks, frozen corpses, and shattered ambitions. Joachim Peiper sat inside what remained of his command car, its engine silent, its fuel long since exhausted. Around him, the men of his Kampfgruppe, once a spearhead of Hitler's final gamble, now waited, weary and cold, for the end they knew was coming. He thought back to that strange, almost absurd moment in Honsfeld. 50,000 gallons of American gasoline, more than his entire column had dared to dream of. For a brief instant, it had felt like salvation, as if fate had turned its favor toward him. The barrels gleamed under the pale light, stamped with the unmistakable insignia of the United States Army. But as the fuel was pumped into their tanks and the engines roared back to life, a sobering truth took root in his mind. That much fuel, simply left behind, abandoned without concern, told him everything he needed to know about the power of the enemy they faced. The Americans could afford to lose what Germany could no longer produce. They could abandon thousands of gallons in the snow, destroy entire convoys, and still feed their armies with an endless stream of resources flowing from across the Atlantic. The realization struck him harder than any artillery barrage. This was not a war Germany could win. Peiper's men drove on, cutting through the fog and ice toward their objective, but each mile deeper into the Ardennes became heavier with futility. The roads grew narrow, choked with wrecks, and soon they faced more than the enemy. They faced the limits of their own strength. American artillery rained down relentlessly. Their fuel dwindled again. Even after seizing Honsfeld's bounty, it was never enough. The panzers that had once symbolized unstoppable power now sat idle, their engines cold, their crews shivering beside them. When Peiper gave the order to destroy their own vehicles, it was not with rage, but with resignation. He knew then that the campaign was finished. The Wacht im Rhein, Hitler's grand counteroffensive, had become a funeral march. The dream of turning the tide was dead in the snow. Peiper's men, some still carrying American rations, set their own tanks ablaze, watching as black smoke curled into the sky, a final salute to an army that no longer had the strength to fight its destiny. From a distance, American reconnaissance pilots saw the columns of smoke and reported back, German armor burning in the woods. To them, it was another victory. To Peiper, it was the last truth he could no longer deny. Germany's engines were dying not from enemy fire, but from exhaustion, from starvation, from the empty promise of an empire built on borrowed time. When he finally surrendered, the the war was already decided. The roads he had once conquered were now filled with American supply convoys stretching endlessly to the horizon. Fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, field kitchens, and fresh reinforcements. They were the living proof of what industrial war truly meant. For every gallon Peiper's men had fought and bled for, the Americans could summon 1,000 more without pause. The numbers told the story with merciless precision. 1.8 billion barrels of oil to Germany's 33 million. Each figure, each barrel, each drop of fuel was another nail in the coffin of the Reich. No amount of courage, no tactical brilliance, no desperate gamble could alter that truth. The war was not only fought on the battlefield. It was fought in the factories, in the refineries, in the ceaseless pulse of production that powered a nation determined to win. As Germany's cities burned under Allied bombing and its armies retreated across every front, Peiper's fleeting triumph at Honsfeld became a grim symbol of the futility that consumed the Third Reich. That discovery, 50,000 gallons of enemy fuel, had offered a glimpse not of salvation, but of disparity so vast it bordered on hopelessness. In his later reflections, he would call it the worst thing that could have happened, not because it doomed his unit in battle, but because it revealed the war's deeper truth. They were not fighting an enemy of equal footing. They were fighting a force that could replace every loss tenfold, an enemy whose strength came not from ideology, but from inexhaustible industry. The Battle of the Bulge dragged on for weeks after Peiper's surrender, but its outcome was already written in the frozen mud. The German offensive collapsed, their lines shattered, and the last reserves of the Wehrmacht vanished into the forests of Belgium. The Allies advanced again, their tanks fueled, their skies filled with bombers, their soldiers supplied with everything from ammunition to coffee, luxuries unthinkable for a German soldier by 1945. In the end, the war did not end in Berlin's ruins or at Hitler's suicide alone. It ended here, in the snow and smoke of the Ardennes, in the realization that Germany's strength was an illusion sustained only by desperation. Peiper's fuel capture was both a moment of victory and a confession of defeat, a final act in a tragedy that had begun years before, when Germany chose war against a world that could outproduce it 1,000 times over. As the years passed and history's judgment grew colder, the image of those fuel drums at Honsfeld remained one of the war's most ironic symbols, a fleeting glimmer of hope that, in truth, illuminated the darkness of Germany's impending collapse. Peiper himself would never fully escape the shadow of that winter. The war had given him fame, then infamy, and finally, the bitter clarity of hindsight. He had seen the future that day in Honsfeld, not in the form of victory, but in the realization that the war machine he served was running on borrowed fuel, in every sense. The discovery of that gasoline did not save him. It exposed him. It exposed all of Germany. The empire of steel, fire, and fanaticism had reached its end not because its soldiers stopped fighting, but because its engines stopped running. And so, as the snow continued to fall over the forests of Belgium, the last flames of Peiper's tanks faded into the night. The silence that followed was not peace, but the sound of exhaustion, the sound of an empire burning out. The Battle of the Bulge would be remembered as Germany's final roar, but within it lay the quiet truth of its defeat. In the end, it was not the courage of men, but the capacity of machines, the flow of fuel, the rhythm of production that decided who would rise and who would fall. What Peiper saw that winter was not merely the ruin of his army, but the beginning of a new age, one where wars would no longer be won by passion or pride, but by power, logistics, and the relentless might of industry. And in that cold realization, he understood that Germany had already lost long before the first shot of the Ardennes offensive was ever fired.